Well, it's really a pleasure to include a writer in our series who kind of crosses genre boundaries the way you do with your book, Obedience. Although the book is billed as a thriller, and it definitely is, it's pretty much of a literary novel in lots of ways too. And so I wondered if maybe you'd start off by talking a little bit about that. It's a beautifully written book, and
thank you.
Just wonderful to read page by page, in addition to making you want to go on and see what's going to happen next. So tell us about how you came to write this particular kind of book.
Well, I cut my teeth when I was a teenager on Stephen King, and I've always been interested in entertainments. You know, that's why I began reading novels. It's what I'm sort of most drawn to. I want to be, you know, sort of turning the pages, and that's why I read. But when I got to college at Center, and especially when I got to graduate school in New York, I moved away from that into the literary. And I remember somebody asking me or telling me about a mystery novel when I was in college, and I just sort of scoffed at it as if that were below me somehow, and read no genre fiction at all for literally years. And I think what happens is, you know, we had children, my wife and I, and we sort of fell into the domestic life. You get a job, and reading becomes a thing that is, the time for it, you know, it shrinks. And so genre fiction makes a lot of sense just for practical reasons. And I began to see, for a time I was really interested in experimental writing, especially experimental poetry. And I began to see some parallels between genre, sounds crazy, but genre fiction and experimental fiction. And really what the genre writers are doing is they are, in a sort of subliminal way, a lot of them are saying, we're not going to deal with the conventions of literature. In fact, we're going to sort of turn those conventions, the best genre writers do this, we're going to turn those conventions on their head, and we're going to tinker with them. And we don't care what you call art, you know, we don't care what you call literature, we're going to sort of do it our way. That's a very kind of rebellious attitude to have if you're a writer, and it immediately made sense to me that writers would be doing that. And so I sort of sought mystery and thriller writers who were doing different kinds of things. And so it would make sense that Obedience is a merge of those two styles, because I came from enjoying entertainments, and I also came from a background of enjoying literary fiction as well. And I think it's the book, I clearly see it as sort of a combining of those two things.
Well, yes, and the fact is that the writing itself, one of my problems with genre fiction, and I love to read a good mystery or a good fantasy or something that is a genre piece, and I long for ones that are better written, that where the writing itself, page by page and paragraph by paragraph, is pleasurable as it is in your book. So this is a wonderful thing, because you're exactly right about the time crunch that we're in, and the fact that we want something that causes us to turn the page, to look ahead. And this book definitely does. Its plot revolves around a college class, and I happen to know you have taught a few of those yourself. But in this particular class, a logic and reasoning class, the professor comes in the first day of class, and basically the entire course is that the students must solve this puzzle, what at first appears to be a purely academic exercise, but which he also prefaces very clearly in the first day by saying, if you don't solve this within the length of time, 6 or 8 weeks, whatever the class is, this woman will die. Polly will be killed. And so it's really intriguing, because as the class goes along, of course, immediately some students say, oh, this isn't for me. And it begins to zero in on the few students that, as we get into the novel, we understand that they have been almost handpicked or somehow for this particular experiment, or this particular assignment, let's say, rather than experiment. And so they begin to understand that maybe even their own lives depend upon them solving. I mean, how in the world did you think of something like that as a premise for a novel? That's just...
I was actually going to do it. I was thinking about, I was getting bored with my classes that I was teaching. I was teaching freshman composition,
yes,
basically, and if you've taught
yes,
those
I've
classes,
taught those.
it becomes a grind
Right,
quickly.
right.
And I had taught it for 5-6 years,
Right.
and so I was teaching the same thing. I was using the same textbook every single semester, and I originally did that because I was so afraid of moving off the lesson plan. You know,
Right.
Donald Barthelme has
how
a
that
great
is.
story about the lesson plan, and it becomes this farce where the teacher will not, just refuses to look away from the plan.
Right.
And so I was driving along one day, and I thought, I need to move off the plan. It's been years, literally, and I need to find something else. And I thought, what if I walked in the first day of class and said, there's been a murder, and you have to solve it, and we're going to write about forensics, we're going to read mystery stories, we're going to treat the class as if it's an investigation into a crime. And then I quickly thought that's crazy, that I would never ever get away with anything like that. But what an interesting setup for a thriller. And everything in that one instance, the only thing I've ever written, even short fiction, where the whole plot of the novel fell into my mind in just a matter of a second or two.
Wow.
Everything that I kind of thought on that drive ended up in the book, and that's what a writer really wants. A writer wants to sort of conceive it and to write it in the same way.
Yes.
And so I was lucky enough that this book, I was able to do that, and mainly because of the structure of the book. It is sort of easy, and it kind of sets itself up to guide you through it. Even as the writer, I could go back to the class, return to the class, return to the crime, return to the mystery, and it sort of had an inherently easy structure to follow.
So in other words, you know there's going to be a class the next week, and
that's
there's
right.
going to be an additional set
Yes.
of information given, and then you know sort of what the facts of the case originally are, and those kind of help shape the book.
Yeah.
So, but what was interesting to me in reading the book was that the plot of the book, or the force of the book, the drive, is really as much from, or in the end, more from the characters' own inner lives and their experiences, their hang-ups, their past life that's brought them to this point, more than the plot devices. And here's where this book really does diverge from a lot of genre fiction, where plot is the main overriding force that drives the book forward. Could you speak a little bit to that? Because this is a tricky place where these two things merge too, to do that completely and well on both sides. How did the characters' personalities and experience enter in?
I was interested and worried about plausibility right off, because you know, to follow this thing, a reader cannot get into a situation where he or she says this couldn't happen. And so I was interested in that, and I was worried about it. And so one of the things I sort of thought about right off the bat was, what kind of people would continue with this class? Because I've received a lot of reader email and various things where the person will say, I would have just left the class. When the professor comes in and says, there's been a kidnapping, you have to solve this. This is the only assignment in this class. A lot of people would say, at one point for publicity for the novel, I talked to a lot of college students, and they were interviewing me for the college papers. And it was amazing how many of these students told me, I love this book, but it was really not, you know, I really had trouble with the plausibility of it, because I'm a student right now, and if any of my professors told me that, I would have been out the door. And so I knew that right up front. I knew it was going to be a big thing. And so one thing I sort of had to choose and do was that the characters needed to be damaged in some way. I figured those were the kinds of people who would go through it. And so the three characters who come to the forefront in the novel, who the novel revolves around, all have something in their past that have damaged them a little bit. They're struggling from some major betrayal in their past, and so they want to cling to something. I mean, Mary, the main, who I consider the main character, she wants this challenge of this class. She's been hurt in a previous relationship, and she's kind of like fighting for something to believe in. And I think she would be the type of person who would go along with this, who really wouldn't say, I don't know, this is a weird situation. I think she would go sort of full force into it.
I think you're exactly right. I mean, you made her very believable, and one of the most believable things about her was her drive to please this professor, which is very plausible as a good student who wants to solve the problems that the professor confronts. I mean, this whole issue of power, the powers that people have over each other, is an important part of the novel as well. And how did your experience as a teacher play into that aspect of it?
Well, what you notice when you teach, especially I think if you're a younger man, you notice a lot of sort of these students, they want to do well for you. And not only that, they'll believe most of what you say. I've said this in every interview I've ever given, but I used to tell my students things, and I would go home later and check my facts, and sometimes the fact would be wrong. I would give the students, for instance, I remember telling them about William Faulkner at one point, and I said William Faulkner was born in a certain year. And I got home and I thought that might not be right, so I looked it up, and Faulkner was actually, I was way off on his birthday. But the students, you know, a couple of them would have known that because we had talked about Faulkner before, but they just nod and they put it in their notebook, and they're very diligent about wanting to do well. They don't want to sort of buck the system at all. They don't want to speak out when they're not, when they feel like something's a little bit off. And so I took that and used it obviously as the title of the novel, Obedience, and I used it as sort of a pedestal for these power issues that happen in every college that I've ever been a part of. And that allows Williams to sort of get in with these students. He has authority over them. And they sort of they bend, especially Mary, the female main character. She kind of just bends back and says that I'm going to allow this to happen because it's so interesting and I want to get an A. And that's something you also find. These students really want their resumes to look good. And so Williams, he preys on that as the professor of this class. I mean, he's just kind of, he goes right after it, and the students follow him into it.
Well, that's very believable. Who were your models and influences as a writer? You mentioned Faulkner, and I know that in other interviews I've read that you've done, you talked about yourself as a Southerner, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But any particular writers or professors or people that you had that were influential?
When I first read Faulkner, I was sort of blown away in the way that is bad. Because when I read Absalom, for instance, I remember reading a little bit of it and closing it and thinking to myself, there is no way I can ever touch that. This is the sort of apex of what can be done with the written word. And it's kind of devastating for a writer to get into that because you don't want to go back to the keyboard. You don't want to go back to the work because you'll always pale in comparison to somebody like that. And so you kind of just have to sort of get over it somehow. You have to say, I'm doing a different kind of thing. The genius that I have maybe is completely different than the genius that he had. But even before that, I mentioned Stephen King earlier, and you know, it's kind of passé to even talk about Stephen King. I was in Amsterdam giving interviews recently, and I got into a discussion about Stephen King, and the reporter immediately kind of said, you know, I mean, it was sort of his gesture. It was like, you know. And then he got into a discussion about genre fiction as a whole, and he asked me, well, why do you write this thing? I mean, when there's better stuff out there to write. And I think King was not interested in that. He sort of had an idea that he could write for the common man because his language is so easily understandable. Totally different than Faulkner. But if you read Stephen King's interviews, he holds Faulkner up as a model. So I see a lot of comparisons between those two writers. And then later, the suspense writer Peter Abrahams, who not a lot of people know about, but he's writing things that aren't so commercial, that aren't so sort of bogged down in these trappings of the thriller genre. He seems to be doing things for his own pleasure and things that are intensely inventive. And I think he's just a fantastic writer. And I have to mention the poet John Ashbery as well, who was a huge influence on me, and he was one of the reasons I went to Bard College and never got to meet him, strangely enough. He wasn't part of that program, but his influence is heavy on the program. And Ashbery was another one of those writers who had a Faulkner-esque influence on me when I first read him. Was completely sort of charged and had the belief that anything was possible in writing.